Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we leave the olive groves of Greece and the marble halls of Olympus. We journey east, across deserts and seas, past the Indus and the Ganges, until the earth rises, higher and higher, into the spine of the world. Tonight we enter the land of mountains, of kukuri and courage, of kings who worshipped Shiva and warriors who laughed at death. Tonight we tell the story of the Nepal Anglo War. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. Part 1. The land before the storm. In the beginning, there was no Nepal as we know it, no unified kingdom, no single throne. There were only hills and valleys, rivers that cut through stone like blades, and 100 small principalities scattered across the southern slopes of the Himalayas. The Kathmandu Valley, a bowl of green rice fields ringed by emerald mountains, was the heart. There, 3 cities, Kathmandu, Patan, and Bhaktapur, competed in art, trade, and war. Their kings built pagodas of carved wood and gold leaf. Their craftsmen cast bronze statues of gods with many arms. Their priests whispered mantras that had echoed for 1,000 years. But beyond the valley, the land was wild. To the west, the kingdoms of Gurkha, Lamjung, Tanahan, and Palpa. To the east, the Kiranti lands and the forests of the Limbu. To the north, the high passes where Tibetans traded salt for rice. To the south, the flat, steamy plains of the Terai, where tigers stalked the tall grass and malaria waited like a silent assassin. This was a land of many gods, Hindu and Buddhist, animist and folk. The mountains themselves were divine. Mashapucher, the fishtail, was never climbed, for it was said to be the home of Shiva. The great peaks, Gauri-Shankar, Langtang, Kanchenjunga, were not mere rock but living deities, watching over the valleys below. And the people who lived in their shadow were as hard as the granite they walked on. Among these hills, in the small principality of Gurkha, a dynasty was born. Its founder, Prithvi Shah, took the throne in 1559. He was a Rajput prince from India who had found refuge in the hills. His descendants ruled for 2 centuries, but they ruled only a tiny patch of earth, no larger than a fingernail on the map. It was not until the middle of the 18th century that a king arose who would change everything. His name was Prithvi Narayan Shah. He was not tall, not handsome, not given to grand speeches. But his eyes saw what others did not. He looked at the divided valley, at the quarreling kings, at the endless petty wars that bled the land year after year. And he said, Nepal is a garden of many flowers. It must be one garden, with one gardener. He began slowly, patiently. He married into the royal family of Kaski. He befriended the kings of Lamjung and Tanahan. He bought weapons from the British in India, for they were already there, the East India Company, spreading like a slow tide. Then, one by one, he took the kingdoms of the valley. Kirtipur fell after 3 bloody assaults. In the final siege, a bullet struck Prithvi Narayan's cheek. He carried that scar for the rest of his life. Kathmandu fell in 1768, Patan and Bhaktapur soon after. The valley was united. But Prithvi Narayan did not stop. He pushed east into the Kirat lands, west into the Chaubizi Rajya, the 24 kingdoms, and north toward Tibet. By the time he died in 1775, he had forged a nation that stretched from the Thistha River in the east to the Kali River in the west, a territory far larger than any Nepali king had ever ruled. He left behind a warning, written in his Divya Upadesh, Divine Counsel. He had watched the British, the red-faced foreigners, trading cloth and guns in India, conquering one princely state after another. He wrote, "This country is like a yam between 2 stones. One stone is the Mughal, the other is the British. But the British are the greater danger. They are traitors who become rulers. They will come to our borders. We must be ready." His successors, Pratap Singh Shah, Rana Bahadur Shah, and then a child king, Gurvan Bikram Shah, did not fully heed his warning. They continued expanding west, into Garhwal and Kemo, lands that the British considered their sphere of influence. They raided villages across the Terai, crossing into British territory. They gave sanctuary to fugitive Indian princes. And they refused, politely, firmly, to recognize the British East India Company's claims over the lowland plains. The company, for its part, was at the height of its power. It had crushed the Marathas, humbled the Mughal emperor, and turned Bengal into a vassal. Its Governor-General, Lord Hastings, then Marquis of Hastings, looked at Nepal and saw not a nation but an irritant, a small, mountainous kingdom that dared to stand in the way of British commerce and British prestige. And so the stage was set. Two powers, one rising from the sea, the other from the mountains. Two visions of the world, the British vision of order, trade, and empire, the Nepali vision of independence, honor, and Berta, the warrior's path. Neither would yield. Neither could afford to. Part 2, The Drums of War. The year 1814 was not kind to the world. Napoleon had been exiled to Elba, but the echoes of his wars still rattled across Europe. In America, the British burned Washington. In India, the monsoon failed in some places, and famine gnawed at the edges of the company's territories. And in the hills of Nepal, a young king, barely 20 years old, sat on a throne of carved sandalwood, listening to reports from the southern border. The king was Gurkha Shah. He was not a warrior like his grandfather. He was thoughtful, soft-spoken, and prone to illness. But around him stood men of iron, his regent, Queen Lala Triparasundari, his chief minister, Bhimsen Thapa, and a generation of generals who had grown up fighting in the western hills, Amar Singh Thapa, Balbhadra Kunwar, Yujir Singh Thapa, Ranajor Singh Thapa. Bhimsen Thapa was the true power behind the throne. He had risen from obscurity to become the most influential man in Nepal. He was ambitious, cunning, and proud, perhaps too proud. He believed that the British were merchants, not warriors. He believed that the mountains would protect Nepal. He believed that the Gurkha soldier, with his curved kukuri and his unbreakable loyalty, was worth 10 company sepoys. He was not entirely wrong. But he was not entirely right, either. The British, for their part, had been preparing for war for 2 years. Lord Hastings had issued an ultimatum: return all disputed territories, except a British resident in Kathmandu, and cease all expansion beyond the Kali River. The Nepali court, divided between hawks and doves, rejected the ultimatum. The doves, led by the diplomat Rajguru Gujraj Mishra, warned that war with the company would be suicide. But Bhimsen Thapa and the generals shouted louder. "We have never bowed to any foreigner," they said. "We will not bow now." And so the war came. The British assembled 4 columns, each numbering between 4,000 and 10,000 men. They were armed with Brown Bess muskets and artillery, cannons that could fire round shot and grape shot. They were led by experienced officers, General David Ochterlony, Major General Rollo Gillespie, Colonel Julian Maubrey, and others. Their plan was simple: invade Nepal from the south and west, capture the capital, and force the Gurkhas to surrender within a few months. The Gurkhas had no such numbers. Their entire army, including irregulars, numbered perhaps 15,000 men. They had few cannons, and those were mostly small brass pieces captured from Indian princely states. Their muskets were often older than their grandfathers. But they had something the British lacked: they were fighting for their homes, their families, their gods. And they knew every path, every ridge, every hidden stream in the hills. The war would not be short. It would not be easy. It would be fought not in open fields but in terraced hillsides, in dense rhododendron forests, in narrow defile where a handful of men could hold off 1,000. It would be a war of forts, hill forts built of stone and mud, perched on cliffs, surrounded by ditches and stockades. It would be a war of ambushes and night attacks, of hand-to-hand combat with kukuri and bayonet. And it would produce heroes on both sides, men whose names would be sung by their grandchildren's grandchildren. Part 4, The War Spreads, Jitgar, Jaitak, and the Western Front. While the guns thundered at Nalapani, other battles raged across the length of Nepal's southern frontier. The British had planned a coordinated advance, but the Gurkhas did not cooperate. They fought a defensive war, falling back from one fort to the next, trading space for time, bleeding the British with every step. In the west, the British column under Colonel Julian Maubrey advanced toward the fort of Jitgar, commanded by the veteran Gurkha General Amar Singh Thapa. Amar Singh was already a living legend, a man in his 60s who had fought in dozens of campaigns, who carried a kukuri so heavy that ordinary men could barely lift it, who slept on the ground and ate the same rations as his soldiers. He was called the Lion of the West. The battle for Jitgar lasted weeks. The British bombarded the fort with heavy artillery, but Amar Singh's men held on. They counterattacked at night, slipping through the British lines, cutting down sentries, and disappearing into the dark. The British began to suffer from disease, malaria, dysentery, cholera, as the monsoon rains turned the camps into swamps. Colonel Mowbray grew frustrated. He ordered a frontal assault on the fort, a desperate gamble. The Gurkhas met it with a hail of musket fire and rolling stones. The British broke and ran, leaving their wounded behind. Mowbray himself was carried from the field with a shattered leg. The siege of Jitgar was abandoned. But the British did not give up. They sent a fresh column under General David Ochterlony, a man as patient as he was brilliant. Ochterlony had studied the Gurkhas carefully. He knew they could not be beaten by brute force. He would outflank them, cut their supply lines, and starve them out. He marched his army through the mountains, bypassing the main Gurkha forts, and appeared in the rear of Amar Singh Thapa's position. The old general found himself surrounded, his men exhausted, his ammunition almost gone. He had no choice but to withdraw. He burned his supplies, spiked his cannons, and led his army on a fighting retreat through the snows of the high Himalayas. Many died, from cold, from hunger, from British pursuit, but Amar Singh survived. He would fight again. Further east, another Gurkha commander, Ranajor Singh Thapa, held the fort of Jaithak. The British attacked again and again, but the Gurkhas refused to break. At one point, a British shell landed inside the fort, killing a dozen men. Ranajor Singh calmly ordered the bodies removed and the wall repaired. He wrote to Bhimsen Thapa, "We have no fear. We will fight until the last man." The British eventually took Jaithak, but only after weeks of siege, and only because the Gurkhas ran out of water. They surrendered with honor, marching out with their kukuris still at their sides. Part 5, the Eastern Front, the Battle of Harirapur. While the west blazed, the British also launched an offensive in the east, toward the fort of Harirapur, guarding the approach to the Kathmandu Valley. This column was commanded by Major General John Sullivan Wood, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. He had under his command nearly 8,000 men, including 2 regiments of European infantry. The fort was held by a Gurkha force of about 2,500 under the command of General Yudhir Singh Thapa, Bhimsen's younger brother. The Battle of Harirapur was different from the western engagements. Here, the terrain was even steeper, the jungle denser. The British had to cut their own roads through the forest, dragging their cannons up slopes so steep that the artillery horses often slipped and fell to their deaths. The Gurkhas harried them every step of the way, snipers in the trees, rolling boulders from the ridges, and sudden charges that left a dozen British dead before vanishing into the mist. When the British finally reached the fort, they found it built on a knife-edge ridge, approachable only from a narrow saddle. Yudhir Singh had dug trenches and planted sharpened bamboo stakes in every possible approach. The first British assault was repulsed with heavy losses. The second fared no better. On the third, the British managed to plant a ladder against the wall, but a Gurkha soldier leaped from the parapet, kukuri in hand, and cut down 3 men before being shot. His name was Kalu Thapa, and his bravery became a rallying cry for both sides. The siege dragged on for 2 months. The British brought up heavier guns and began to pound the fort day and night. The walls cracked. The water cisterns broke. Yudhir Singh's men were reduced to eating their pack animals and boiling leather. At night, they could hear the British campfires and the laughter of their enemies. Still, they held. But on the 48th day, a British shell struck the magazine. The explosion killed 50 Gurkhas and opened a breach in the wall. The British stormed the breach, and this time they did not retreat. Yudhir Singh ordered a counterattack. The Gurkhas charged with kukuris drawn, howling the battle cry of Jai Mahakali, Ao Gorkhali. Victory to the great goddess, the Gurkhas are coming. They drove the British back twice, but the third wave overwhelmed them. Yudhir Singh was wounded in 3 places, but his men carried him from the field. Harirapur fell. The British had won the fort, but they had lost nearly 1,200 men, and they were still 100 miles from Kathmandu. The monsoon had arrived, turning every path into a river of mud. Wood's army could advance no further. They settled into a siege of the next fort, but the war in the east had effectively stalled. Part 6, the turning point, the Battle of Milan. By the spring of 1815, the British had made progress. They had captured the western forts and pushed into the hills. But the Gurkhas still held the approaches to the Kathmandu Valley. The most formidable of their remaining positions was the fort of Milan, perched on a ridge overlooking the Sutlej River. It was commanded by none other than Amar Singh Thapa, wounded, exhausted, but unbroken. General Ochterlony led the final assault on Milan. He brought with him the heaviest artillery seen in the Himalayas, 18-pounder cannons that had to be dragged up the mountains by teams of oxen and elephants. The siege lasted for months. The British bombarded the fort day and night. The Gurkhas answered with musket fire and defiance. But slowly, the net closed. Ochterlony sent columns around both flanks, cutting the Gurkhas off from their supply routes. The food ran out. The water ran out. The men began to eat their horses, then their leather belts, then the bark of trees. Still, Amar Singh refused to surrender. Finally, in the spring of 1816, Ochterlony sent a message. He offered terms: the Gurkhas could march out with their weapons, their colors flying, and receive safe passage to their homes. It was a generous offer, almost unheard of in a war that had seen so much bloodshed. Amar Singh called his officers together. They debated for a day and a night. Some wanted to fight to the death. Others argued that surrender with honor was better than useless sacrifice. In the end, Amar Singh made his decision. He would not surrender, not himself. But he would allow his men to accept the terms. He gave his kukuri to his son, Ranjor Singh Thapa. "Take this," he said. "It has never known defeat. Keep it so." Then he led a small group of his most loyal followers, fewer than 100 men, and slipped through the British lines under cover of darkness. He disappeared into the mountains, heading north, toward the Tibetan border. He would live out his years as a sadhu, a holy man, wandering the high passes, never returning to the land he had defended for so long. Milan fell. The British had won the war. But they had paid a terrible price, more than 3,000 dead, and thousands more wounded or crippled by disease. And they had learned a lesson they would never forget, that the Gurkhas were not ordinary enemies. They were the finest light infantry in the world. Part 7, the Treaty of Sugauli. On December 2, 1815, the British and Nepali negotiators met at a village called Sugauli, in the Terai Plains. The Nepali delegation was led by the diplomat Chandra Sekhar Upadhyay. The British were represented by Colonel Paris Bradshaw. The talks were tense. The British demanded the cession of all territories west of the Kali River, including Garhwal, Kemo, and much of the Terai. The Nepali negotiators pleaded, argued, and delayed. But they had no army left to fight, and the British knew it. The terms were harsh. Nepal would cede all territories west of the Kali River, including Garhwal, Kemo, and much of the Terai. It would accept a British resident in Kathmandu. It would not maintain diplomatic relations with any other foreign power without British consent. It would allow the British to recruit Gurkha soldiers for their army. The Nepali court was divided. Bhimsen Thapa wanted to continue the war, to fight one more battle, to die if necessary. But the king, still young, still ill, had lost his appetite for blood. He signed the treaty on March 4, 1816. The war was over. Nepal had lost half its territory. It had lost thousands of its best soldiers. It had lost its illusion of invincibility. But it had not lost its independence. Unlike the princely states of India, Mysore, the Marathas, the Sikhs, Nepal remained free. The British, having tasted the Gurkha kukuri, decided that annexation was not worth the price. The treaty also contained a secret clause: the British would not interfere in Nepal's internal affairs. And they kept that promise for more than a century. Nepal became a buffer state between British India and Tibet. It preserved its monarchy, its culture, its religion. And the Gurkhas, those same men who had fought so fiercely against the British, became the British Empire's most loyal soldiers. They would fight in the trenches of Flanders, the jungles of Burma, the deserts of North Africa. They would win Victoria Crosses and write their names into the annals of military history. But that is another story, a story of the 20th century, of 2 world wars, of the end of empires and the birth of nations. Tonight, we close our tale in the early 19th century, with the guns silent and the mountains still. Part 8, The Legacy. What the war made. The Nepal-Anglo War was not a large war by European standards. It involved perhaps 30,000 men on both sides, fewer than a single day of Napoleon's battles. It lasted only 2 years. It ended with a treaty that has been forgotten by most of the world. But in Nepal, it is remembered as the war that saved the nation. The poet Bhanubhakta Acharya, the first Nepali to translate the Ramayana into the Nepali language, wrote verses about Balbhadra Kanwar and Amar Singh Thapa. School children memorized their names. Statues were erected. Kukuris that had been bloodied at Nalapani were preserved in temples and worshipped as sacred relics. The war also reshaped Nepal's society. The defeat forced the ruling elite to modernize, to build roads, to train a professional army, to open schools. Bhimsen Thapa, who had led the nation into the war, fell from power after the king's death. He was imprisoned and eventually committed suicide in 1839. But his legacy, a centralized, unified Nepal, endured. And the British, for their part, never forgot the Gurkhas. In the decades after the war, they recruited tens of thousands of Nepali soldiers. These Gurkhas became the backbone of the British Indian Army. They fought in the Sikh Wars, the Afghan Wars, the Boxer Rebellion. They became famous for their bravery, their discipline, and their signature weapon, the kukuri, which they would sharpen on the eve of every battle. Even today, the Gurkha regiments of the British and Indian armies continue the tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Nalapani, they hold a ceremony to honor Balbhadra Kanwar and the men who fought beside him. Part 9, The Echoes in the Hills. Tonight, as you listen to this story, the mountains of Nepal still stand. The same peaks that watched Prithvi Narayan Shah unite the kingdom, that echoed with the cannon fire of Nalapani, that sheltered Amar Singh Thapa in his final exile, they are still there. The same rivers flow. The same forests bloom with rhododendrons every spring. And the same spirit, the Burr, valor, and himmat, courage, that the Gurkhas showed on those bloodied hills, it lives on. Not just in the kukuri, not just in the military regiments, but in the very soul of the Nepali people. They are a small nation, tucked between giants, China and India. But they have never been conquered. They have never surrendered their identity. They have never forgotten that they are the children of the Himalayas. The British came. The British fought. The British signed a treaty and left. But Nepal remained. So ends our story of the Nepal-Anglo War, a war of kings and generals, of forts and kukuris, of honor and sacrifice. It is not a myth, like the tales of Olympus. It is history, real, bloody, and true. But it has become something like a myth. It has become a story that Nepali parents tell their children, sitting by the hearth on cold winter nights. A story of how a small nation faced a great empire and refused to kneel. And now, the torches are low. The fire crackles. The wind carries the scent of pine and snow. It is time to rest. Good night. Part 3, The First Blood. Nalapani. The first shots of the war were fired in the west, where the British columns advanced into Garhwal and Kamoa. But the most famous battle of the opening campaign took place near the hill fort of Nalapani, overlooking the town of Dehradun. The fort was commanded by a young Gurkha captain, just 25 years old, named Balbhadra Kanwar. He was a man of medium height, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to burn. He had under his command about 600 soldiers, barely enough to hold a single bastion, let alone a fort. But he had something else, a will of iron. The British force that approached Nalapani was led by Major General Rollo Gillespie, a man already famous for his bravery. He had fought in the West Indies, in Java, in India. He was said to be fearless, almost reckless. He had a habit of leading charges personally, sword in hand, his white hair flying in the wind. On the morning of October 31, 1814, Gillespie's artillery opened fire on the fort. The cannonballs smashed into the stone walls, sending splinters flying. But the Gurkhas had built their fort well. The walls were thick, the angles clever. The first barrage did little damage. Gillespie ordered an assault. His sepoys and British soldiers rushed up the slope, shouting battle cries. The Gurkhas waited until they were close, very close, and then opened fire with their muskets. The first volley tore through the British lines. Men fell, screaming, rolling down the hill. The survivors pressed on, only to be met with a second volley, then a third. Then the Gurkhas leaped from the walls, kukuris flashing, and fell upon the attackers with a ferocity that shocked even the veterans. The British retreated. Gillespie, furious, ordered another assault, and another. Each time, the Gurkhas threw them back. The day ended with the British camp in chaos. More than 200 of their men lay dead or wounded. Gillespie himself had been struck in the leg by a musket ball, but he refused to leave the field. That night, Balbhadra Kunwar gathered his men. He knew the fort could not hold forever. The British had brought heavy cannons, and they were digging trenches closer and closer. The Gurkhas had little food, less water, and no hope of reinforcements. But Balbhadra did not speak of surrender. He spoke of honor. He spoke of the kukuri, which must never be drawn without being bloodied. He spoke of Nepal, which must never kneel. The siege lasted another 4 days. On November 4th, Gillespie ordered a final, all-out assault. He led it himself, climbing the ladder to the wall. At the top, he raised his sword, and a Gurkha musket ball found his chest. The great general fell backward into the arms of his men. He died within minutes. But the assault did not stop. The British swarmed over the walls, bayonets glinting. The Gurkhas fought from room to room, from stone to stone. When their ammunition ran out, they used their kukuris. When their kukuris broke, they used their bare hands. By the end, only Balbhadra and a handful of survivors remained. They cut a path through the British lines and escaped into the forest. The fort of Nalapani had fallen. But the British had lost nearly 1,000 men, and their most famous general. And the name of Balbhadra Kunwar became a legend, spoken with awe on both sides of the border.